Hi everyone, and welcome back to this vlog. I am Caitlin Jones, and this was supposed to be way more frequent. Obviously, I've been a little bit busy. Life and college kind of happened at the exact same time, but I am still writing, and I decided to pick this vlog back up. I was actually challenged to this video by my lovely friend and fellow author Katie Masters, who published the book Brenna Morgan and the Iron Key, which you should totally read. Her original video in the description below. But Katie decided to come up with a tag about books that inspired you as a young adult or a child to become the person you are today. I shaped it a little bit differently, and I decided to go with books that shaped me to become the author I am today, which was actually harder to peg down than you think it is. I actually was a big reader as a kid. I picked up reading by myself somewhere around 7 or 8 years old, so I didn't necessarily have, one or two books that ended up inspiring me. It was more like, 12. So I more or less narrowed it down to the books that I felt mattered to me and shaped the voice of the kind of author I am as of today. Okay. Ta-da! I actually don't know how to go through these, so I may start with the ones that I read most recently and go backward from there. I shouldn't have to tell you what Howl's Moving Castle is. Most people know it from the movie by Studio Ghibli, or they probably know it from Diana Wynne Jones' original series. This series was actually one of my favorite books when I was a teenager. I was handed this off by my best friend, and after watching the movie, not before. One thing I love about Diana Wynne Jones' writing in particular is that it's so different from other fantasy books that were coming out at the time. It's technically an 80s fantasy novel, which is very much known for being more sword and sorcery, Dungeons and Dragons-y. This is more about this versatile, more Sabriel-ish Garth Nix type world. And one thing that I love about Diana Wynne Jones' writing style is how clipped it is. A lot of fantasy books have a tendency to be too long, and this is one thing that I attempt in a lot of my writing, is a very clipped but literary style. Many of my friends wanted me to cover this book. Artemis Fowl. This is actually my original paperback too. I actually think the reason I write fairy folklore is not because of Artemis Fowl, but it's because I grew up with Irish folklore. But Artemis Fowl did help. Owen Koffler is one of the first authors I got to see who handled fairy folklore differently. I mean, other than Holly Black, you didn't have that many particular authors who were covering Irish folklore in that way. And it was sort of a cool thing to see. Artemis Fowl plays more like a spy book than it does an actual fantasy novel. It's funny to return back to Artemis Fowl after like 10 years. Because I've totally realized too, I have a character just like Holly Short and Mulch Diggums that pop up in my book, so I hope that doesn't offend Owen Koffler. Good God, what did I do to it? I read C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia books probably 3 times in my entire lifetime, and out of all of them, I think a lot of people expect your favorite is either going to be Caspian or The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, more commonly. And my favorite is The Magician's Nephew, and I seriously don't know what happened to this copy. It's more than likely I read it to death. And I wish I could tell you why I keep coming back to it. Because it's not a particularly dynamic novel in the Chronicles of Narnia story. If anything, it's a prequel, and not a lot of people like Diggory. But I don't know, something about the way it's structured and something about the way it portrays the characters, especially in the early portrayals of like the White Witch. I always loved that as a kid, and I always liked that it was a subtle, less complex fantasy novel than the rest of them. And C.S. Lewis was good at that anyway. A lot of his fantasy novel elements, much like in the other Chronicles of Narnia books, have more to do with subtle things than they have to do with these big, huge Tolkien-esque issues that we see sometimes in other fantasy novels. Not my copy, but I love this book. I don't know what it is about A Wrinkle in Time. I know it means a lot to a lot of people. I think something about it in the way it talks about childhood The way it talks about his characters, it's just so different and so wonderful. I really still think about some of the ways that the world building is done in A Wrinkle in Time, because nothing else in it, I don't know if I've seen another book like it again or since, but maybe that's what's good about it. I don't know if this is a cheating kind of book. I didn't want to put any big classics in here, but I'm gonna do it anyway. I love this novel. I think Dorian Gray gets a bad reputation now because Dorian Gray is kind of an old hat book for an old hat audience. Dorian Gray was actually my introduction to heavier literary Gothic fiction. I read it at 16 the first time, and kind of fell in love with Oscar Wilde's turn of phrase and his characters. They feel so alive and real in the comparison to, some characters, and you get literary fiction, you get so bogged down by some of the prose and language, you don't know what to do. Oscar's different, and always has been for me, and I think it kind of helped build my interest in Gothic fiction, which is the majority of what I write. This paperback's old. I probably read these when I was 7 or 8. In fact, I think they might have been the first chapter book, or very much close to the first chapter book I ever read. The series abruptly stopped, which I learned recently is because the publisher had no interest in renewing the author's contract, and this makes me very angry because it ended on a cliffhanger and I'll never know what happened now. And that's how much this influenced me. The basic plot of Unicorns of Balinar, which I can remember in bits and pieces, it's been a long time, is that this princess named Ariana gets transported into the earthen world from her magical realm because she is being chased by this evil known as the Shifter. In the way, she brings this unicorn named Sunchaser, and they enter the magical realm and they meet a dog, and they bring this annoying bratty earth girl with them who turns out to be not that bratty. It's very young. It stuck with me on such a fundamental level. Keep bringing up fantasy. I'll have a different one in a minute. But there's something so nice about getting back to the basics on a fantasy novel and going to these roots of these really old style fairy tale stories, which I love. My Grimm's is over there, I think, next to my Stranger Things pops. What's really great though about my book cover, wow, aww, I take that. I have an awful story to tell. And I have to admit something, because I feel really bad. I stole this. I didn't steal it. I was 12 years old when I got to read Inkheart for the first time. I was put in this homeschooled group. And when I read Inkheart, I was given it by a reading teacher who taught at the education center. And she said, all of our students love this book, you'll like it too. And she was right. And not that long after, maybe about, I read the book over 2 months, and not that long after, we ended up leaving that particular e-school to go to another building. And I borrowed this from their library, and I never gave it back. And I'm very sorry. And that hasn't changed how much this book really means to me. Not only that, but Cornelia Fugate as a writer means the absolute world to me. She basically changed how I write and inspired me to, and again, I have abused it. In fact, if you look inside the book itself, and I actually, when I was a kid, because I didn't get a chance to return it, I erased her name from it and put mine in. Again, I'm so sorry. It's just something about this book. I go back to it every now and again and reread, and I'm blown away. I really, out of all of Fugate's books, it is the one that stayed here. And Fugate's writing style, much like Lemony Snicket's, doesn't talk down to its audience, it talks up. So, and I don't know if that's because it's translated from German, but a lot of what she writes is very literary and very heavy in references. So if you're transporting all these characters from other books, you have all of these old references to other fiction. She quotes other novels at the beginning of every chapter, like something I do over and over again, especially in my main series. I quote novels, I quote poetry, and I saw nothing wrong with it because I'm like, if she can do it, so can I, which is really talking oneself up. I could probably pull down the whole series, but I'm not going to torture you. I love Lemony Snicket. I've actually heard Lemony Snicket described as baby's first literary novel because there are so many allusions and references in and throughout the series that you don't get when you're like a kid. And so when you read it again as an adult, you're like, oh my god, that's a reference to George Orwell. I didn't catch that. I think one thing that really makes Lemony Snicket last and why it stayed with me, other than it being my first gothic novel, because I had never really approached gothic fiction before. And a lot of what Lemony Snicket does harkens back to Edgar Allan Poe, Oscar Wilde. I've heard people complain about that with Lemony Snicket, like, oh, it's too educational. It always has so many big words in it. And, you know, I was one of those kids who hated getting children's books and chapter books that weren't written, you know, that were written for kids because I didn't like being talked down to. And oddly enough, that's one thing Daniel Handler, who is Lemony Snicket, thing he said about writing children's books is he wrote Lemony Snicket with the intention of never talking down to children. And it's one of those things, even though I don't necessarily write for children, I write young adult, but I try to write young adult in a way that is not meant to talk down to its audience. I prefer to be able to communicate with my audience on a level that I know they're intelligent. And I like that Lemony Snicket does that too. That about covers it, actually. I continue to work on my books, and I actually am out on query right now, so Chime Hour is in limbo at the moment, but you can read my novella, The Spectre and the Governess, on Amazon, which is right now, I think, 99 cents, so you are not wasting any money. My short stories, which you can find on Wattpad, consist of all over the genre because I can't pick where to write. So I have horror short stories and science fiction, and I'm working at present on a Beauty and the Beast science fiction Frankenstein crossover thing. So be patient with me. Thank you so much for watching. I know I have not been a very good vlogger, but I am hoping to get back on this and actually have more content. I also wanted to do some more challenges with Katie Masters. We may even do an interview or two together. I'll see what she wants. And I hope you come check back in. Make sure if you've not subscribed to hit that subscribe button. And I will talk to you guys later.